I'm sure some of you may have, or may be having still a wonderful conversation with those questions, but thank you, Father Ed, for your words. Gracias, Padre Ed, por sus palabras. Y gracias a todos por estar aquí hoy y por haber venido a todas o a la mayoría de estas charlas cuaresmales. And thank you, everyone, for being here tonight and having come during several, if not all of these Friday conversations. I am sure you all have noticed that all of our talks this Lent have been bilingual in one way or another. While this is a current need in the San Antonio region and perhaps in the country, it is not something new for humanity. And it is, in a way, the way it will probably be in the future as well. Habrán notado que todas nuestras charlas han sido bilingües de una manera u otra. For example, having to speak different languages, or at least hearing different languages in one's local area, would not have been uncommon to Jesus and the people who lived in Palestine at the time. We see this in the Gospels, and I will point out some instances where we see them. Let me begin by pointing out that if you review the history of Israel a bit, you will see that the geographic area in which the people of Israel lived was a contested or a conquered land for most of their history. That is, Jerusalem and the entire region in the northern Arabian Peninsula, what in ancient times was known as Palestine, or now as the Holy Land, was a conquered or occupied land for much of the time. And that seems to be continuing even today. This means that people most likely learned to speak another language, and for the most part had to see and interact with quote-unquote strangers or quote-unquote foreigners who also spoke another language. In fact, the Old Testament makes this clear at times, and the New Testament tells us this in a very subtle way. Let me now just point some places in the Bible where this happens. There are both, again, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, many references to, for example, things the Hebrew people, or the Jews, as the Gospel of John calls them, do and do not do, contrasting sometimes cultural and religious aspects and issues with that of the pagans, quote unquote. The Gospel of John is good at pointing those things in several parts of it. For example, given their religious beliefs, Jews do not enter the house of a non-Jew before Sabbath so that they can be ritually pure. In the Gospel of Mark, we hear Jesus addressing God the Father as Abba. And Mark explains why he is using that foreign word, at least because the Gospel is not written in Aramaic, but in Greek. That could be another conversation to be had. And in the letter of St. Paul to the Romans, he also explains why he is using the term Abba and not just a simple Father. En el Nuevo Testamento escuchamos a Jesús y a San Pablo dirigiéndose a Dios Padre como Abba y no solo como Padre. Y Marcos explica por qué está usando esa palabra extranjera, al menos porque el Evangelio no está escrito en arameo, sino en griego. Y en la carta de San Pablo a los romanos, también San Pablo explica por qué está usando el término Abba y no solo un simple Padre. The Gospel of Mark, which is the oldest of the Gospels, and perhaps because of that has several references in Aramaic, also tells us in chapter 5, for example, the story of the young girl Jesus raises from the dead. Part of that story reads, He took along the child's father and mother, and those who were with him, and entered the room where the child was. He took the child by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. The girl, a child of 12, arose immediately and walked around, and that they were utterly astounded. Well, there is, of course, a good theological commentary to do from this story. I just want to point out, once again, the need for translation here. While it is not just to clearly state what is meant, it is worth noting that it is given to us in a second language. The point in this commentary is that there is a need to speak or understand another language to get sometimes the whole story and its meaning. While the Gospel of Mark has the most words in the original Aramaic, other Gospels also do, and they have, of course, references to what Jesus did. But it is interesting to me that the more recent Gospels tend to tell the story without the need for translation at times. Perhaps because people have gotten used to what we would call the lingua franca of the time, that being Greek, not even Latin, Greek. But let me point to you one more story of a gospel story using words in Aramaic. You can find this story in either the Gospel of Mark or the Gospel of Matthew, with a slight difference in translation. In the Gospel of Mark, it reads, "He went on to say, 'How well you have set aside the commandment of God in order to uphold your tradition. For Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and whoever curses father or mother shall die. Yet you say, if a person says to father or mother, any support you might have had from me is korban,' meaning dedicated to God. You allow him to do nothing more for his father or mother. You nullify the word of God in favor of your tradition that you have handed on, and you do many such things." Again, here you see a word that needs explanation to be understood, especially to be understood well in a second language. It is not a word that by itself may be understood in its full meaning without the cultural and especially the religious context. De nuevo, aquí vemos una palabra que necesita explicación para entenderse bien en el segundo idioma. Es una palabra que no se entendería sin tener en cuenta el contexto cultural y especialmente el contexto religioso. Aunque el Evangelio de Marcos tiene la mayor cantidad de palabras en el arameo original, otros evangelios también lo tienen. Pero me resulta interesante que los evangelios más recientes tiene la tendencia a contar la historia sin necesidad de traducción. Quizás porque para entonces la gente ya se ha acostumbrado a lo que le llamaríamos la lengua franca de la época, que en ese tiempo era el griego, no el latín. Another instance in which we see that Jesus, in his loving decision to go to the cross for us, also finds himself in a different cultural and linguistic environment is when he faces Pontius Pilate in the Praetorium. I am sure most of you, if not all of you, have seen the movie The Passion of the Christ. Remember? How many people have watched it? Wow, for those of you, if you haven't, that's a good cultural introduction to the Passion of the Christ in a different language. It's directed by Mel Gibson, and all of it is in Latin with subtitles. I just wonder what was going through Jesus' mind as he had the conversation with Pontius Pilate. Did he need a translator? Or did he speak Latin? Or maybe both of them spoke Greek? I would find it interesting if Pontius Pilate spoke Aramaic, for example. I doubt he did. These are all details that the Gospels do not tell us about, but that somehow form part of the environment in which Jesus and all of the Jewish people lived in at the time. Now, I will not tire you with such explanations and stories anymore, except just one more. And in the ultimate example of either being a foreigner or a conquered person, the inscription on the cross of Jesus reads what? We know the translation, right? Do you remember what the actual gospel story tells us? Can anyone tell me? The Gospel of John, again, in chapter 19, tells us the story this way. So they took Jesus, and carrying the cross himself, he went out to what is called the place of the skull, in Hebrew, Golgotha. They crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on either side, with Jesus in the middle. Pilate also had an inscription written and put on the cross. It read, Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews. Now, many of the Jews read this inscription because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city. And it was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. So the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews, but that he said, I am the King of the Jews. Pilate answered, what I have written, I have written. End of that passage. This is just interesting to me. It wasn't written only in Latin or in Greek, which again was the lingua franca at the time. Nowadays, English is considered the language of business or the lingua franca. I imagine Pontius Pilate wanted to make sure that everyone understood the inscription and had no doubt as to why Jesus was crucified. Esto es simplemente interesante para mí. Esto no fue escrito solo en latín o en griego, que era la lengua franca en ese momento. Hoy en día el inglés es considerado el idioma de los negocios. Me imagino que Poncio Pilato quería asegurarse de que todos entendieran la inscripción y no tuvieran ninguna duda de la razón por la que Jesús fue crucificado. So, you may be wondering by now, why am I bringing this up at the end of this Lent? Well, if we slow down to think and reflect about some details in the Gospels, and we know a little bit of the history of Israel, we can see that Jesus died in a culturally diverse and chaotic environment. Yet he expressed the ultimate way of loving in the midst of all of that. Again, even his cross had an inscription in 3 languages, just so that no one would miss the reason why he died or was killed. And so perhaps we can also ask ourselves nowadays, are we missing the reasons to love one another? I hope we are not. I hope we can get over the fray of political and ideological divisions, of economic challenges and fears, and learn to love others and ourselves. Y entonces, quizá también podemos preguntarnos hoy en día, ¿nos estamos perdiendo o no nos damos cuenta de las razones para amar al otro? Espero que lo que estemos haciendo, espero que podamos superar la lucha y la dificultad de las divisiones políticas e ideológicas, los desafíos y preocupaciones económicas, y aprender a amar a las demás personas y a nosotros. It seems to me that we can glean some learnings from the Bible and from your experience with this mission this Lent. This certainly is not the usual kind of Lenten mission, especially for you. Yet, it is very biblical and very theological. We call this pastoral theology, which is finding ways in which we can apply our theological and biblical learnings of life to today. Let me finish with what I think is one major learning you can take home and for the future from this mission and this Lenten season. The major lesson to take can be what is called sometimes the preferential option for the other. I mention this, taking some clues from the famous preferential option for the poor teaching that has come to us from liberation theology via Latin American theology. While that has been now enshrined into church teaching explicitly, because it has been implicitly taught by the church since her beginnings, the teaching is now more conscious to us because of the struggles, good and bad, of liberation theology. But what do I mean by quote-unquote preferential option for the other? In his book, Living Mission Interculturally, and taking a clue from theologian Johannes Metz, Father Anthony Giddens uses the term preferential option for the other to speak of Jesus himself as the stranger among us. And Father Giddens says, the need for us not to simply to reach out to the stranger who is quote-unquote the other, but also to identify and embrace that status and role. That is, that we are both, sometimes or most of the time, strangers and insiders. And Father Giddens continues to say, the point is to remind us that the other not only is someone else, but also, in the context of intercultural community and commitment to cross-cultural mission, quote-unquote, the other is the person in your mirror, yourself. From here, he says that once we learn those two aspects, being the stranger and treating others as the stranger, we can develop mutual relationships. This may lead us to what other authors have called a culture of acknowledgement of the other, of our differences, as mutually enriching and not as limitations or boundaries. This will lead us to becoming more aware of ourselves and others as children of God. This will lead us, Father Giddens says, to quote-unquote creating a culture of welcome and inclusion. De hecho, dos otros autores dicen que volverse intercultural es un proceso de liberarnos de una perspectiva limitada de la vida o volvernos más plenamente humanos con una mayor conciencia y sensibilidad hacia uno mismo, los demás y la relación entre ellos. Es decir, creamos una comunidad para todos a medida que aprendemos unos de otros y nos afirmamos unos a otros. Mi esperanza y oración para todos nosotros y para ustedes durante esta experiencia de misión cuaresmal es que hayan adquirido un mejor conocimiento de la Biblia y hayan aprendido a ver las cuestiones culturales y lingüísticas como un medio más a través de las cuales el amor, incluso en su jornada hacia la cruz, puede mostrarnos el camino. In fact, two other authors say that becoming intercultural is a process of liberating ourselves from a limited perspective on life, or becoming more fully human with a greater awareness of and sensitivity to self, others, and the relationship between them. That is, we create community for everyone as we learn about each other and affirm one another. So, my hope and prayer for all of us and for you during this mission experience is that you have become more knowledgeable about the Bible and have learned to see cultural and linguistic issues as one more issue through which love, even in his journey to the cross, can show us the way.